Okay, old guy, just rambling. We're looking at VW and Audi hubs, hub carriers, and bearings, right? So you have your hub somewhere, Mark 1s up through about Mark 3s. And I can be wrong on this, so don't quote me. But Audis before about 2001, they used a hub, they used a bearing, and they used a hub carrier. So you took your hub carrier, you pressed your bearing in, and you pressed your hub in. Today we're going to take one of those apart. We're going to take the bearing out, we're going to take the hub off, then the bearing, and then we're going to put another bearing back in with the hub. And we're going to show you how to do that. So these are the parts we have today. We have our hub carrier, which is off an Audi coupe or an Audi B3. We have our bearing, and we have our hub. So the bearing goes in and the hub goes in, and we need to press those in. Now, one thing I have here, this is called my assembly lube. This is Loctite LB8012, and it's molybdenum disulfate paste. I like to call it my assembly lube. I use it when in here, in the bearing area. I use it in here, I use it on here, I use it in the bearing, I use it everywhere. So anyway, if you'll notice, this bearing is not the same all the way, the hub is not the same all the way across. It's raised in this portion. This matches this bearing. This bearing is actually two halves inside with a narrower half in the rear. So this bearing needs to sit like that. So these are the pieces we're using today. I have some tools, obviously, but this is what we're going to put together. This is the kit I use for removing and putting in my bearings. Now, sometimes you can't always get a bearing or a hub out with these. There is a limit. The limit is the threads on this rod. So if you're taking out, and we'll show you this later, if you're taking a bearing out and it gets really hard to do and you're not feeling it pop, you could be bunging up the threads on this. You want to have a lot of grease on this in order to prevent that. And one of the reasons I like this particular kit, this kit's been around since the early 80s, is this has a bearing. So it's not trying to, the bearing turns as you turn the item. This way, when you're up against something, the bearing's turning and you're not trying to move this. The other thing I like about this kit is that these holes are tapered. And they're tapered so that this fits in. Like this is tapered, that's tapered. I don't know, I just think it seems to work pretty well that way. Now, obviously I'm probably biased. I've had this kit about, 30 years. I think it was first invented in 1977. It's called Tools. And actually they're still in business. I've used this kit a lot. I've used it for more than just bearings and hubs. I've used it to take bushings out of, not control arms, but like on a Mark 5 VW, a control arm fits in a bracket. I've taken those bushings out with this. Used it in various ways because all these parts, and I keep spare different size tubes around, and it just works for me. Anyway, this is the tools we're going to use to do our bearing and hub into the hub carrier and out. Okay, so one of the things we're looking at here is there's a lip right there, okay? Can you see it's a lip? All right, in a B2, that is probably, or VW or whatever, that could be a circlip. The later VWs had this ridge, but the early ones and the early Audis had a circlip there. So when you're pressing in the bearing, it's going to come up and it's going to hit that little lip and stop. In a B2, you would basically have a circlip that it would stop against. Now I've already coated everything, but the inside of the hub, again, this is molybdenum disulfide paste. I put it on the inside of the bore. I put it on the inside of the bearing, which I haven't gotten there yet. I just coated everything and I put it on the hub. So this is what you need to make sure you don't get rust in there from water later on, and it's easier to come out. The other thing, when you put this bearing in, you want to make sure that this short side inside the bearing is out here, because if you put this bearing in the opposite way, it's not going to work. I learned a long time ago not to use a impact when I do this. I just run it up. Now you're going to know when it's getting close because the bearing's going to be recessed a little. You want to make sure that this is going to clear that bore. Just like inside, the piece like this that's inside, it's up against that lip. That way when you push the bearing in, the bearing goes all the way to the lip. Now there's all kinds of hub tools out there, and I'm sure they all work fine. Another reason I like this one is this bearing. When I turn this, instead of this riding on this piece of steel and you're trying to turn a bolt on that, you've got a bearing. And the bearing probably makes it a little bit easier. So now we're past the lip. We're going to go slow. And when we get there, we're going to stop. Boom. There we are. That's tight. So now we're going to take this apart and we're going to check the backside to make sure that bearing is up against the lip. The only time I use the impact. Anyway, our bearing's in. Still rotates, other side rotates. Now we're going to check the back side. Okay, so as we can see here, the bearing is all the way up against that lip. So we're good. That bearing is seated. And if you notice in there, the smaller area with the larger diameter ridge is all the way in the front. See? Okay, we reset this up so we can install the hub onto the bearing. One of the differences on this back side is this plate like this that's on the back side. You need it small enough so it's actually inside the lip and up against the bearing. You don't want it on the lip like we did when we installed the bearing. The biggest problem with if you don't do it that way is you'll turn this in, and if you've got that gap where either your lip or your circlip is, it'll push the center of the bearing right out, and you will have ruined a brand new bearing. Now, as you can tell, this is a little bit loose. It wants to align itself as it starts in, so you just kind of support it. Now, this turns in until it stops, basically. Boom, there you are. That didn't take much at all. So we take all the tools off. And you now have one hub installed with new bearing, if you're using a new bearing. Now remember, this bearing was old. Actually, it's still tight. There's no wobble. Even though bearing was used, there's no wobble in this hub. So it turns easily. And basically, you've got a brand new bearing in your hub, and you're done. I know this is kind of backwards as far as the video goes, because most of the time you're removing the hub and the bearing and then putting them back together. I know we're doing it differently this time. So what we're going to do is, this is, as you can tell, is a lot different than the other. You have to have this space in order, well, different than when you put it on. You have to have this space in here so when you pull the hub, it has somewhere to go. Now these arms, which only wrap around about halfway, I rest them somewhat on the two pieces of the part of the hub that sticks out for the caliper, the G60. And on the back side here, all I have is that nut with the taper on it, because it fits in the back of the hub and pulls it off. So we're going to pull this out. And now this bearing isn't, is used. And that's one reason I'm doing this. So we need to watch it a little bit to make sure that it stays in there. Hopefully it will. If it breaks off, well, that's another story. Sometimes that outer race will come off with the hub. There we go. As you can see, this hub is tapered to fit inside the end of the hub. Now sometimes when you do that, when you take out that hub, you will pull out this outside race. Now trying to prevent that, or even this bearing, you can heat this up a little bit. You can soak it on the back side, put it like this, PB Blaster, Cryol, Seafoam stuff, and you let it soak in there, and sometimes it'll soak in. You can heat this up. When you're pulling out stuff, you can tap it with a brass hammer. All kinds of ways you can do it. And some, especially the bearing, not so much the hub. Now that we have the hub off, we're going to pull the bearing. Now this is kind of tapered on the inside, so that when you put it on here, it'll kind of line itself up. Now I like to put this lip up so it's inside the bearing, adds a little more support to it. Again, this particular piece here this particular piece here fits up against the bearing. It misses that lip, or the clip that goes in there. God, why can't I think of that right now? Snap ring. Jeez. It's what happens when you get old. Start forgetting stuff. So when you get up close, you want to make sure that's up against the bearing. Now, like I was saying a little bit before, this bearing's kind of hard to get out. If you've lived in an area where the hub carrier's gotten a little rusty, you're bound to have water seeped in the back, especially if the last person who had your car didn't put anti-seize in there. So you can set this so it's on its face, and like I said, you can use a rust remover. And you can heat this up when you tension this up. Where did I put my wrench? I'm doing good. Can't even find my wrench. Oh, there it is. I dropped it on the ground. So, when you tension this up, you put some tension on it, and let's say it gets hard to, right away, you can't move this. Okay, two things you're going to look at. One, you could tap this with a brass hammer. You could heat this up. And a lot of times when you're doing this, that bearing will kind of snap when it comes loose. Now, the biggest problem that we have on this is you don't want to ruin these threads. I mean, these come with a pretty decent bolt, these hub removers. But if you put too much force on it, you're going to ruin the threads and need a new bolt. I think I've gone through, 2 or 3 over the last 30 years. So what you do is if it gets to the point where you can't turn this, it gets real hard. Okay, this is still turning. But if it gets too hard, then you're going to need a press. Now, I've never owned a press, 12-ton or 20-ton press, but that's what you'd have to use. And then you get, you can use that plate that's in there, you can use the pieces from this, and it'll work for you. But don't over tighten the bolt. So anyway, we're going to move this, and it's going to come out for us. Well, this will get easier. Hopefully, but it is turning. Of course, I probably make it look a little harder, but I'm 73 years old, so it is harder. Anyhow, we're getting close now. It's getting pretty loose. And the bearing's going to end up inside here. And that's the reason this is so deep. Okay, we're getting real close now. It's almost easy. Well, maybe not. Not as close as I thought we were. Now we're getting easy. It's hard to tell. It all depends. And there we go. Drop my wrench again. So that's basically, I'm dropping everything. We got our bearing out. But you can see how this piece here fits inside there, and it works against the bearing and not anything else. So anyway, bearing's out. So this is what we have. One bearing used and it still didn't come apart, and one hub. These are my thoughts. This is what I do. You don't have to.